Flight 447 was cruising smoothly at 40,000 feet when everything went silent. Both engines failed simultaneously. Captain Mitchell and his co-pilot tried every emergency procedure they knew, but nothing worked. The aircraft was falling like a dead weight with 256 passengers aboard. As panic spread through the cabin, a 17-year-old girl with a backpack full of her late father's research suddenly stood up. She walked calmly toward the cockpit and said something that made everyone freeze, "I know how to land this." Nobody believed her. But she was their only chance. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning had started like any other morning for Captain James Mitchell. He'd arrived at the airport 2 hours before his scheduled departure, checked in at the crew room with the kind of quiet routine that comes from 28 years of flying commercial aircraft. He was 56 years old, with salt and pepper hair, steady hands, and the kind of calm demeanor that reassured nervous passengers just by his presence. His career had taken him all over the world. He'd flown through thunderstorms over the Atlantic, navigated through volcanic ash clouds near Iceland, and had experienced more aviation emergencies than most pilots would encounter in a lifetime. Yet he'd never lost anyone. That was the thing Mitchell was most proud of, his perfect safety record, his ability to remain calm under pressure, his understanding that passengers placed their absolute trust in him and his crew every single time they boarded an aircraft. Today he was scheduled to fly Flight 447 from New York's JFK International Airport to Los Angeles International, a route he'd flown hundreds of times over his career. The aircraft was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of the most advanced commercial aircraft ever built, carrying 256 passengers plus a crew of 12. It was a Tuesday in April. The weather reports showed clear skies across most of the continental United States, and the winds were light. Everything seemed perfect. Mitchell had a daughter who'd recently gotten engaged, a wife waiting for him at home in San Diego, and a retirement plan that he was looking forward to in about 7 years. This was going to be a routine flight, followed by a hotel stay in Los Angeles, and then a return flight back to New York 2 days later. It was the kind of predictable schedule that made a pilot's life manageable. Mitchell had completed his walk-around inspection of the aircraft with the methodical precision that aviation demanded. He'd checked the fuel levels, examined the landing gear, inspected the engines from the ground, reviewed the maintenance logs, and confirmed that every system on this particular aircraft was functioning within normal parameters. The 787 was relatively new, only 5 years old, with excellent maintenance records. He knew this aircraft better than he knew his own house. Flying it felt like piloting an extension of his own body, an aircraft that responded to his touch with the kind of precision that made a pilot's job feel like an art form rather than a mechanical exercise. Over the course of his career, Mitchell had flown dozens of different aircraft types, but the 787 had always been his favorite. It was reliable, efficient, and handled like a dream in almost any weather condition. The pre-flight inspection was something Mitchell never rushed, no matter how many times he'd flown an aircraft. He'd known pilots who'd cut corners on their inspections, who viewed the walk-around as a formality rather than a genuine safety check. Mitchell had never been one of those pilots. He'd seen accidents that resulted from small things being missed, a loose panel, a hydraulic leak that started small, a bird strike that damaged a component in a way that wouldn't show up on automated diagnostics until it became critical. He spent nearly 40 minutes on his inspection, checking every visible surface of the aircraft, examining the landing gear components for any signs of wear or damage, testing the flight control surfaces by hand to ensure they moved smoothly and correctly. He looked at the engines from multiple angles, checking for any signs of leakage or damage. He examined the fuselage for any cracks or dents that might have been missed by the ground crew. By the time he returned to the cockpit, he was satisfied that this aircraft was in perfect condition for a cross-country flight. One of the maintenance technicians, a man named Torres who'd been working on this particular aircraft for the past 2 years, had approached Mitchell as he was completing his inspection. Torres had been maintaining the 787 through all of its operational history, and he had that kind of intimate knowledge of the aircraft's quirks and characteristics that came from working on the same plane hundreds of times. "She's running perfect, Captain," Torres had said. All systems checked out during last night's maintenance. This is one of the finest aircraft we have in the fleet. Mitchell had appreciated Torres's professionalism and attention to detail. Those kinds of ground crews, the ones who took pride in their work and treated each aircraft like it was their own responsibility, were the backbone of aviation safety. Without them, pilots couldn't do their jobs effectively. In the cockpit, Mitchell reviewed the flight plan with First Officer David Chen, a younger pilot in his early 40s with sharp eyes and faster reflexes than Mitchell's. They discussed the route, the expected weather patterns, the fuel calculations, and the various emergency procedures that pilots always discussed before departure but hoped they would never need to use. Chen was competent, smart, and had the kind of focus that made him reliable during crisis situations. They made a good team, Mitchell's experience balanced with Chen's younger perspective, creating a cockpit dynamic that was professional and effective. Chen had been flying with Mitchell for about 3 years, and they developed the kind of professional rapport that comes from successfully handling dozens of flights together. Mitchell respected Chen's analytical approach to flying and his willingness to speak up if he disagreed with something Mitchell was doing. That kind of openness in a cockpit was essential for safety. In the cabin, the passengers began boarding around 9:15 a.m. They filed down the jet bridge in the typical mix of business travelers, families with children, elderly couples, and solo travelers. Some passengers were nervous about flying, gripping armrests before the aircraft even pushed back from the gate. Others scrolled through their phones or read books with the practiced ease of frequent flyers. There was a woman with 2 young children, a boy and a girl, who'd been crying at the gate about having to leave their grandmother behind. There was an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, heading to Los Angeles to spend time with their grandchildren. There was a young man in military uniform, heading home on leave. There were businesspeople with laptop bags and carry-on luggage, checking emails and taking phone calls up until the moment the cabin doors closed. And then there was a teenage girl sitting in seat 28C by the window, who seemed different from all the other passengers in ways that nobody else on the aircraft could have possibly understood. By 10:15 a.m., Flight 447 had pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway, and received clearance for takeoff. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, the engines building to full thrust, and then the nose lifted as the main landing gear left the tarmac. The aircraft climbed steadily into the clear April morning, the city of New York falling away beneath the wings. As the aircraft reached 10,000 feet, the landing gear retracted with a mechanical grinding sound. The climb continued smoothly, 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 25,000 feet. Flight attendants began their service, pushing the beverage cart down the aisles, offering coffee, orange juice, and snacks to passengers who were settling in for what they expected would be a smooth, uneventful cross-country flight. Captain Mitchell checked in with air traffic control, received updates on the flight path, and confirmed that everything was proceeding normally. He and Chen discussed fuel consumption, wind patterns at altitude, and the expected time of arrival in Los Angeles. The aircraft continued climbing, ascending through 30,000 feet, then 35,000 feet, approaching the cruising altitude of 40,000 feet. At 10:47 a.m., with the aircraft passing through 39,800 feet, something changed. The first sign was subtle, so subtle that passengers wouldn't have noticed, and even an average pilot might have missed it. But Captain Mitchell, with his 28 years of experience, heard it immediately. A slight vibration in the engine tone, a deviation from the perfect harmony of twin Rolls-Royce engines running in synchronized precision. His experienced ear detected the deviation instinctively, the same way a musician can hear a single wrong note in an orchestra. "Did you hear that?" he asked David Chen, not taking his eyes off the instrument panel. Chen's head tilted slightly, listening. "Hear what?" "The engines sound normal to me." But Mitchell was already looking at the instruments. For another few seconds, everything appeared normal. Then the vibration increased. The right engine's power indicator flickered. Then both indicators began showing erratic readings. Mitchell's hands moved instinctively toward the engine controls, running through his mental checklist even as the reality of the situation began to crystallize in his mind. Check engine status on both engines, he said, his voice calm despite the sudden surge of adrenaline that was flooding his system. In the back of his mind, a small voice was screaming that this wasn't possible. Both engines didn't fail simultaneously. It violated the basic laws of aircraft redundancy and safety design. But they were failing. Both power indicators dropped. The vibration became a shudder. And then, in a moment that would define the rest of this day and change the lives of everyone aboard, both engines went silent. The distinctive roar of jet engines, the sound that had been present in the background of this flight since takeoff, simply ceased to exist. The aircraft was now 40,000 feet above the Earth with no power. It was a 787-ton object moving at 460 miles per hour with no engines to sustain that flight. Physics, gravity, and the fundamental reality of aerodynamics took over immediately. "We've got an emergency," Mitchell said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. "Double engine failure. Contact air traffic control immediately." David's hands moved across the radio with the muscle memory of training that had been drilled into him 1,000 times. "New York Center, this is Flight 447 declaring an emergency. We have dual engine failure at 40,000 feet. Both engines have shut down. Requesting immediate assistance." The response from air traffic control came back quickly, but even through the radio transmission, Mitchell could hear the shock and confusion in the controller's voice. "Flight 447, New York Center acknowledges emergency status. We are initiating emergency protocols. Can you restart either engine?" Mitchell was already working through the emergency procedures. His hands moved across the control panel with precision, starting with the most basic procedures, checking the fuel crossfeed valve, verifying that the fuel selectors were on the correct position, confirming that the backup systems were engaged. Attempting engine restart on number 1. Initializing engine start sequence. The engine cranked, but nothing happened. No ignition, no power buildup, no indication that the engine was attempting to restart. It was completely dead. "Number 1 is not responding," Mitchell reported. He moved on to engine number 2. Attempting restart on number 2. Same result. Nothing. The engine remained dead, unresponsive to every command, every system restart attempt, every procedure that was supposed to restore power to a failed engine. David was already calculating descent rates on the flight computer, his face showing the strain of understanding what those numbers meant. "We're descending at approximately 1,800 feet per minute," he said. "We're losing altitude faster than any acceptable glide ratio for a commercial aircraft. At this rate, we'll be below 10,000 feet in about 16 minutes. Below 5,000 feet in about 20 minutes. Mitchell understood the mathematics perfectly. An aircraft without engines was essentially a glider, but a 787-ton glider doesn't glide very well. It falls. The descent rate was already excessive, and it would only increase as the aircraft lost altitude and speed. "Contact Pittsburgh Air Traffic Control," Mitchell instructed. "Request the nearest suitable airport for emergency landing. We need options." Mitchell's mind was working through the geography of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the surrounding states. They were currently over Pennsylvania, somewhere near the state's central region. Pittsburgh International was reasonably close, maybe 100 miles ahead. There was also a smaller airport near Harrisburg. But the mathematics of their situation was brutal. At their current descent rate, they might not make it to any major airport. They might be looking at a water landing on one of the rivers or lakes below them, or worse, a forced landing on terrain that wasn't designed for aircraft. In the cabin, the passengers had begun to notice something was wrong. The vibration that Mitchell had heard had translated into a noticeable shaking that lasted for several seconds. Then the vibration stopped, but something else changed. The background hum of the engines, the almost imperceptible sound that formed the sonic foundation of flight, was gone. The silence was profound and terrifying. Flight attendant Maria Santos, a 14-year veteran of commercial aviation, immediately knew that something catastrophic had happened. She felt the aircraft's nose pitch down slightly as the pilots initiated descent. She moved quickly to the intercom, calling the cockpit. "Captain, what's happening? We have passengers asking about the noise." Mitchell felt something cold moving through his body. This was the point where experience training met the brutal reality of situations that training couldn't always prepare you for. He'd spent 28 years flying aircraft, and he'd never encountered a scenario where both engines failed simultaneously and couldn't be restarted. He'd run through the procedures in simulators 100 times, but simulators had buttons to restart the simulation. Real life didn't have those buttons. Pittsburgh International is 78 miles ahead, Air Traffic Control reported. "We're clearing emergency runway. Distance is marginal based on your descent rate, but it's possible." Marginal. That was the word that aviation didn't like to use. Marginal meant that the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Marginal meant that even if they tried their best, even if everything went perfectly, there was still a significant chance of failure. Mitchell was about to respond to air traffic control when he heard the cockpit door open. This wasn't unusual in itself. Flight attendants sometimes needed to communicate with the cockpit during flights. But the timing, combined with the severity of the emergency, meant that something had to be seriously wrong in the cabin. Mitchell turned, expecting to see Maria or one of the other flight attendants reporting a medical emergency or some other catastrophic problem in the passenger cabin. Instead, he saw a teenage girl, couldn't have been more than 17 or 18, standing in the cockpit with an expression of absolute composure. "You need to listen to me," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying an undertone of authority that was strange coming from someone so young. "I know what happened to your engines, and I know how to fix it." David's head snapped around so quickly that it was almost violent. He stared at the girl with an expression of shock and confusion. Mitchell felt something shift in his understanding of the moment. This girl wasn't panicked. She wasn't hysterical. She was speaking with the kind of technical precision that suggested she actually understood something about aircraft systems. "Young lady, you need to return to the cabin immediately," Mitchell said, using the kind of calm authority that captains use to establish order during chaos. But something in her voice, something in the way she was looking at the instrument panel, made him pause. "Who are you, and what do you think you know?" "My name is Sarah Chen," she said. "And I believe my father's theoretical procedures might save this aircraft." David's face went completely white. "Robert Chen. Are you Robert Chen's daughter?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "He died 3 years ago. I was 14 when he passed. He left behind a lot of research about emergency engine failure scenarios. I've spent the last 3 years studying that research. I've run simulations of almost every emergency scenario he documented." Mitchell and David exchanged a look that suggested they both understood they were in the presence of something extraordinary. Robert Chen had been a legendary figure in aviation, a test pilot who'd spent 15 years developing theoretical procedures for emergency scenarios that aviation textbooks said shouldn't happen. He died in a mysterious accident that the aviation community still discussed in hushed tones. "What do you think happened to our engines?" Mitchell asked, deciding in that moment to trust his instincts about this strange teenage girl. "Bird strike damage to the primary hydraulic line," Sarah said immediately, stepping closer to the instrument panel and pointing at specific readouts. The hydraulic pressure dropped below a critical threshold, and the engine management system, programmed to shut down engines if it detects a potential catastrophic failure, shut both engines down simultaneously as a safety protocol. "It's not a mechanical failure. It's a system response to detected danger." David was nodding slowly. That would explain why both engines went out at exactly the same time. The engine management systems would have received the same signal simultaneously. "Exactly," Sarah said. "And my father developed a theoretical procedure for restarting engines in exactly this scenario. You need to use the auxiliary power unit in a specific sequence, cycling it through a precise timing protocol while simultaneously initializing the backup hydraulic pressure and managing the fuel crossfeed valve. Mitchell felt the weight of decision descending on him. They were at approximately 28,000 feet now, descending at 2,100 feet per minute. They had maybe 13 minutes before they'd be too low to attempt any kind of engine restart. The conventional wisdom of his 28 years of flying was telling him to reject this teenager's claims, to stick with procedures he knew and understood. But the conventional wisdom of his career had already failed. Both engines were dead and not responding to any standard restart procedures. "How much time do you need?" he asked. "About 8 minutes, Sarah said. "If the procedure works." "And if it doesn't work?" David asked quietly. Sarah met his eyes. "Then we don't make it to Pittsburgh." Mitchell nodded slowly. There were 256 passengers on this aircraft, 12 crew members, and himself and David in the cockpit. There were people below who had no idea that their lives were about to be determined by a decision he was about to make. He could try the conventional approach, attempt to reach Pittsburgh with a degraded descent rate, knowing that the probability of success was minimal. Or he could attempt something theoretical, something that had never been tested on an actual commercial aircraft, something that a teenage girl was claiming her dead father had designed. "All right," Mitchell said. "Walk me through it." Sarah moved to the auxiliary power unit controls with surprising confidence. The APU is designed to provide emergency power to the aircraft, but it's not normally used for engine restart. However, if we cycle it through a specific sequence, initiating startup, allowing it to build pressure, then synchronizing that pressure surge with the backup hydraulic system and timing the fuel cross-feed valve to open exactly at the moment of maximum pressure buildup, it might create enough temporary force to cause engine ignition. "Might," David repeated quietly. "The probability is somewhere between 20 and 30% based on my simulations," Sarah admitted. "But it's significantly better than 0%, which is what our probability is if we just continue descent without attempting it." Mitchell looked at David, saw the understanding in his younger colleague's face. "Initiate the procedure," Mitchell said. What followed was the most intense 9 minutes of Captain Mitchell's 28-year career. Sarah guided them through her father's theoretical procedures with precision that would have been impressive for any trained engineer, let alone a 17-year-old girl. She called out each step in a calm voice that somehow managed to inspire confidence despite the desperate nature of their situation. "APU startup sequence initiating," she said. The auxiliary power unit, which was designed to provide backup electrical power to the aircraft, began its startup sequence. Mitchell and David watched the power indicators gradually building. "Backup hydraulic pressure increasing," Sarah continued. "We're right at the critical threshold. Fuel cross-feed valve needs to open, now." Sarah's hand moved to the fuel valve control, opening it with a precision that suggested she'd done this before, even though Mitchell knew that she'd only done it in computer simulations. The aircraft was at 24,000 feet now, descent rate still steady at 2,100 feet per minute. The APU pressure was building. The hydraulic backup system was online. Everything was lined up for the moment of truth. "Attempting primary engine ignition," Sarah said. "Timing is critical. If we're off by even a second, it won't work." "Ready?" "Ready," Mitchell confirmed, his hands steady on the control yoke despite the adrenaline flooding through his system. "Ignition sequence, mark," Sarah said. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity compressed into a moment. Nothing happened. The engines remained silent. Sarah's expression flickered for just an instant, suggesting she was encountering the possibility that even her theoretical knowledge might not be sufficient. And then they heard it. A sound that started as a whisper, gradually building into something more. Engine 1 was catching. The engine management system was responding to the pressure sequence Sarah had initiated. The startup sequence began, the engine cranking, fuel flowing, ignition occurring. "It's working," David whispered. "Oh my God, it's actually working." Engine 1 built from a whisper to a rumble to a roar, power flowing back into the aircraft. The descent rate began to decrease. The aircraft's attitude shifted slightly as thrust returned to the right side of the airframe. "Secondary engine," Sarah said, her voice steady despite what had just happened. "We need to wait 30 seconds to allow engine 1 to stabilize, then we'll attempt the same procedure on engine 2. The 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes, but Mitchell forced himself to wait. Engine 1 was now producing significant thrust, pulling the aircraft's nose up slightly, the descent rate dropping to 1,500 feet per minute, then 1,200 feet per minute. "Auxiliary power unit cycling again for engine 2, Sarah said. "Same sequence. Backup hydraulic pressure, fuel crossfeed valve timing, and ignition sequence, mark." Engine 2 followed its twin into life. The aircraft transformed from a falling glider into an actual flying machine. The descent rate continued to slow, 1,000 feet per minute, 800 feet per minute, 600 feet per minute. By the time they had both engines running at stable power, they were at 18,000 feet, with a descent rate that was finally within manageable parameters. "Flight 447, Pittsburgh Center, we're showing both your engines are back online," the radio crackled. "Your descent rate is stabilizing. Can you confirm?" Mitchell's voice was thick with emotion as he responded. "Pittsburgh Center, Flight 447 confirms. Both engines restored. We're stabilizing at 18,000 feet. We're going to attempt a landing at Pittsburgh International." In the cabin, passengers who'd been bracing themselves for impact suddenly realized that the aircraft was no longer falling uncontrollably. The descent had stabilized. The engines were running again. The miracle that they'd never dared to hope for had actually happened. Maria Santos moved through the cabin checking on passengers, many of whom were crying with relief. A woman in seat 12B was whispering prayers of gratitude. A man in 34F was holding his wife's hand, tears streaming down his face. The businessman in 28C had finally managed to put his phone away. In the cockpit, Mitchell turned to look at Sarah, who was standing slightly to the side, her expression calm but showing the strain of what she'd just done. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. "My father would have done it himself," Sarah replied quietly. "If he'd been here. I'm finishing what he started." Mitchell placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "No. You're not just finishing what he started. You're taking what he theorized and making it real. You're turning his legacy into action. That's something far more significant than simply continuing his work. You've changed aviation today. You've changed it in ways that will protect people for decades to come. Your father would be more than proud. He'd be humbled by what you've accomplished." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she was trying hard to maintain her composure. The adrenaline that had been keeping her focused during the emergency was beginning to wear off, replaced by the emotional weight of what she'd experienced. She'd spent 3 years preparing for a scenario she'd never thought would actually occur, and now that it had occurred, now that she'd successfully guided one of the most experienced pilots in commercial aviation through a procedure that had never been implemented on an actual commercial aircraft, the reality of it was beginning to sink in. She'd saved 256 lives. She'd proven that her father's theoretical research could work in real-world conditions. She'd changed the course of her own life in ways she couldn't fully comprehend yet. The landing at Pittsburgh International was smooth and uneventful, executed with the kind of precision that suggested the pilots had simply been practicing what they did thousands of times before. The aircraft touched down, wheels making contact with the runway, the landing gear absorbing the impact. The aircraft rolled down the runway, gradually slowing, finally coming to a stop at a designated emergency area where fire trucks and ambulances were waiting, though ultimately not needed. The airport was swarming with emergency services and news helicopters by the time the passengers began deplaning. The story of Flight 447 spread through the media with remarkable speed. News stations began reporting on the dual-engine failure, the emergency landing, and the miraculous recovery. But it was Sarah Chen who became the center of the story, the 17-year-old girl who'd used her deceased father's research to save 256 lives. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah became famous. News organizations interviewed her about her father's research, about the hours she'd spent studying his theoretical procedures, about the moment she realized that her knowledge might be the only thing standing between survival and disaster. Aviation authorities launched investigations into what had happened, examining the aircraft systems, confirming Sarah's theory about the hydraulic pressure failure and the automated engine shutdown protocol. The Chen Protocol, as her father's procedures became known, was eventually incorporated into commercial aviation's emergency procedures. It was no longer just theoretical research. It was now part of the standard training for pilots dealing with dual-engine failures at high altitude. Sarah Chen, at 17 years old, had become the youngest person to contribute significantly to international aviation safety standards. Captain Mitchell kept in contact with Sarah in the months and years that followed. They became connected through the shared experience of flying in the face of impossible circumstances and surviving together. Mitchell helped Sarah understand the impact of what she'd done, helped her process the overwhelming attention that came with becoming the girl who'd saved a commercial aircraft. But more importantly, he helped her understand something profound. What she'd done that day wasn't about luck or impossible odds or miracles in the religious sense. It was about the intersection of preparation, inherited knowledge, and the courage to act on information that others didn't possess. Her father had spent 15 years researching emergency procedures that conventional aviation said shouldn't work. She'd spent 3 years studying his research in depth. And when the moment came, when the universe presented her with a situation that seemed impossible to everyone else, she'd been ready. Sarah's story became one of the most significant stories in modern aviation history. News programs featured her. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story. Universities offered her scholarships. But most importantly, Sarah became a symbol of something that aviation had always known but rarely acknowledged, that sometimes the solutions to impossible problems come from unexpected sources, that sometimes teenagers can understand things that experienced professionals haven't considered, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who've spent years quietly preparing for a moment they never thought would actually come. Years later, Sarah would become a test pilot herself, following in her father's footsteps, continuing his work on emergency procedures and aircraft safety systems. But she would always remember that moment at 28,000 feet when she stood in a cockpit with Captain Mitchell and First Officer Chen and walked them through procedures that her father had theorized but never lived to see implemented. She would remember the moment when Engine 1 caught, when Engine 2 roared to life, when the aircraft that was falling from the sky transformed into an aircraft that was flying again. In the formal investigation that followed the emergency landing, aviation authorities examined every detail of what had happened. They discovered that a bird strike had indeed damaged the primary hydraulic line, causing a gradual pressure loss that eventually triggered the automated engine shutdown protocol. The protocol had been designed as a safety measure. If the aircraft systems detected a potential catastrophic failure, better to shut down the engines in a controlled manner than risk an uncontrolled failure at high altitude. But the protocol had never accounted for the possibility of a crew member understanding an alternative recovery procedure. The aviation community recognized that Sarah's intervention had been extraordinary, not just because the procedure had worked, but because it represented a fundamental shift in how pilots might approach impossible situations in the future. The Chen Protocol was officially adopted by the Federal Aviation Administration within 6 months of the emergency. Pilot training programs were updated to include Sarah's father's theoretical procedures. Aviation safety boards around the world began incorporating the protocol into their emergency response training. The International Civil Aviation Organization recognized it as a significant advancement in aviation safety. Sarah was invited to speak at aviation conferences and universities. She received awards and commendations from pilot organizations and aerospace companies. But more significantly, she was invited to work with the Boeing company on developing new emergency procedures for the 787 and other commercial aircraft. By the time she was 18 years old, Sarah had become the youngest person to officially contribute to international aviation standards, and she'd done it by continuing work that her father had started but never completed. Sarah's relationship with Captain Mitchell remained strong in the years that followed their shared emergency. Mitchell had retired from commercial aviation about 2 years after Flight 447, with his perfect safety record intact and the story of his final flight securing his place in aviation history. He became a consultant for aviation safety organizations and frequently worked with Sarah on developing and testing new emergency procedures. When Sarah decided to pursue a career as a test pilot, it was Mitchell who helped her navigate the process, who reviewed her applications to military and aerospace test pilot schools, and who provided guidance as she started her own career in the field. The passengers aboard Flight 447 never forgot the experience. Many of them wrote about it in articles, in memoirs, and in interviews with journalists. Some used the experience as motivation to do things they'd been putting off, quit jobs they hated, reconcile with estranged family members, pursue dreams that seemed too ambitious. The woman from 12B who'd been gripping her armrest had started a non-profit organization dedicated to aviation safety. The man from 34F who'd been praying had become more religious, convinced that his survival was a direct divine intervention. The businessman from 28C had changed careers entirely, leaving finance to work with humanitarian organizations. And on nights when she couldn't sleep, Sarah would look at her father's research papers, understand that he'd left behind more than just theoretical procedures. He'd left behind knowledge that saved lives. He'd left behind the understanding that preparation meets opportunity in the moments when we're brave enough to act on what we know. She kept one of his notebooks on her bedside table, not because it was fragile or precious, though it was both of those things, but because sometimes when the weight of what she'd accomplished threatened to overwhelm her, she would open that notebook, see his handwriting, see his thoughts about emergency procedures and aviation safety, and remember that she wasn't doing this alone. Her father was still with her, guiding her through his research, his theories, and his lifelong dedication to making aviation safer. The story of Flight 447 became a teaching moment in aviation schools worldwide. It illustrated not just the technical procedures for managing dual-engine failures, but also the human element of aviation safety, the importance of thinking creatively, the value of unconventional knowledge, and the recognition that sometimes the solutions to impossible problems come from unexpected sources. Sarah's story was taught in business schools as a case study in decision-making under pressure. It was discussed in psychology classes as an example of how teenage intelligence can sometimes exceed adult expertise in specialized fields. It was featured in documentary series about remarkable survival stories. But most importantly, Flight 447 and Sarah Chen's emergency response changed aviation culture in a subtle but significant way. Pilots began to take more seriously the input of younger colleagues and unconventional thinkers. Aviation organizations began to value diverse perspectives and non-traditional approaches to problem solving. And the aviation community came to recognize that sometimes the people who understand how to solve the most impossible problems are the ones who've spent years quietly studying the science behind those problems, preparing for moments they never thought would actually come. Sarah often thought about the statistical improbability of what had happened. The odds that a bird strike would cause exactly the kind of hydraulic damage that would trigger the engine shutdown. The odds that she would happen to be on that specific flight at that specific time. The odds that Captain Mitchell would be willing to trust a teenager with such a critical decision. The odds that her father's theoretical procedures would actually work in real-world conditions without any modification. The odds that 256 people would walk away from an impossible situation that should have ended in tragedy. When she thought about all of those odds compounded together, she understood that what had happened wasn't just remarkable, it was extraordinary in ways that exceeded the normal boundaries of probability. And yet it had happened. Sometimes in aviation, in life, in the great sweeping narrative of human experience, the extraordinary does happen. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible. Sometimes a teenager with knowledge that nobody else possesses stands up and changes the trajectory of 256 lives. Sometimes the legacy that a father leaves behind, not just in terms of money or material possessions, but in terms of knowledge, understanding, and commitment to solving impossible problems, becomes the foundation for saving lives in ways that he himself could never have imagined. This was Sarah's legacy now, shared with her father's memory, standing as a testament to the power of preparation, courage, and the willingness to trust in solutions that others haven't yet discovered.